Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Strange Pathways. I'm your host, Scott Mort. I hope you've had a wonderful week. It's getting a bit colder here in Pennsylvania, and it's this time of the year that my mind starts to think, maybe I'd be happier in California. I do have a little spot in California I've picked out. Don't have the money right now to move there, but wouldn't mind it. As I get older and older, these winters take a larger toll on my health. So, being in the woods, in the mountains of Northern California, all kind of toasty and warm, kind of sounds pretty good right now. Our first tale takes us all the way back to the late 1800s, early 1900s. To really understand this tale, you have to understand the Illinois Asylum for the Incurably Insane. This was a massive psychiatric hospital that existed from 1902 to 1973 in Bartonville, Illinois. It's very close to Peoria. Things were a little sketchy in this hospital until one Dr. George Zeller arrived. George Zeller was a very forward-thinking man in terms of psychology for his period. Very much a man several years, maybe even decades ahead of his time. Whereas these state institutions, you could be put in for almost anything. George Zeller was very much about rehabilitation. And in this, he believed that work was important for the human psyche. So a lot of his patients tended to have a job. One of the patients there who did have a job was a man known as Manual Bookbinder. He was mute, and he worked in a printing house as a manual bookbinder. They deemed him insane. And the experts at the asylum diagnosed him with, and I quote, mental aberrations. He was later nicknamed Old Book. Old Book came to the asylum in 1902. Old Book was well liked, but he was filled with sorrow. We're talking about a massive man, a big man. I don't want you to picture like this very waif, this very skinny guy. This was a big man, and he could handle a lot of labor. Dr. Zeller saw this, and he put him on burial detail. There were many patients at this hospital that were unclaimed by their loved ones. And whenever they passed on, they were buried on the asylum grounds. Burials were very common. A lot of these people were in very poor health. Old Book would be sent out to dig the grave. And as the ceremony would begin, Old Book would go to a tree. It was this big elm tree, and this became known as Old Book's tree. This massive man would lean against the tree. He would take off his hat, and he would begin to cry, wail, sob uncontrollably. Even whenever he got older and couldn't really dig the graves anymore, when he would see a funeral procession, his eyes would begin to swell with tears. Nurses would come over, pat him on the back, tell him that it was okay, but he would wail. This man, he felt death too much. I've heard a lot of people kind of say that he didn't really understand death. I believe it was the other direction. I believe this man understood death so well that he could really feel those consequences. He could really feel that pain. Old Book passed away in 1910. Like I said, this is a man that was very well liked, and hundreds of people attended his funeral. Dr. Zeller himself gave the eulogy. And as these hundreds of people are standing, saying goodbye to Old Book, the people turned around and saw Old Book leaning against his tree, crying. Right there, what you heard me do is what the crowd did. Silence. No one can quite believe what they're seeing. Even Dr. Zeller saw it. You think he's standing up there. Dr. Zeller may have had the best view. Dr. Zeller yells, "Open the casket." Now remember, this is 1910, so it isn't as simple as flip a latch, lift up the lid. Coffins are made of wood and they're nailed shut. The lid is ripped open. The people look down. There is Old Book in the coffin. They look back at the tree, and he's gone. Vanished. Fairly shortly after his death, that tree begins to rot away. They send a few men out to chop it down. And a few hours later, they come back to Dr. Zeller, and they go, "We can't do it. Every time we hit the tree with an axe, you could hear someone screaming." Dr. Zeller then sends the fire department to burn it down. And then they come back a few hours later and say, "We can't do it. We started a fire, but we had to put it out. We saw someone in the smoke standing, crying." After all these failed attempts, Dr. Zeller just decides, I saw what I saw. These people saw what they saw. And the elm crashes over one day and falls on its own. To this day, people hear a man crying in Cemetery 2 at what became known as the Peoria State Hospital. If you go there, look for plot number 713. There you'll find a little tombstone for Manuel Bookbinder, 1878 to 1910. In each death he found great sorrow. He wept at each passing tears for the unloved and forgotten. Now, Old Book, we weep for you. My wife and I have been fascinated with death recently. We don't know why. We see how unfair the thought of dying is. How we're brought into this world. We don't really have a choice. How we're made to push our way through it. And then at the end, we get sicker and sicker until we just die. I would probably be an atheist right now had it not been for one incident that happened in my life. It's very hard to deny the existence of an afterlife whenever you have something like what happened to me happen to you. I had an older father growing up. I was born in 1974. My mother was born in 47, but my dad was born in 1918. I know that's quite a gap between my mother's age and my father's age. So we're going to go all the way back to 1990. Around this time of the year, October, November. My mother, Donna Jean Mort, a wonderful woman. Wonderful woman. She passed away in December of 2014. But like all of us, she had her flaws. And one of her great flaws was just the ability to be late at everything. During the last 3 years of my father's life, his name was Paul William Mort, during the last years of his life, he spent a lot of time in the hospital. He had been a smoker. He had quit, actually, the last 10 years of his life. He had been a smoker. But it was a little bit too little, too late. The emphysema, the asthmatic bronchitis, it had taken a toll on his body, as had the medicines he was on. And they had put pinholes through his bones, made them very brittle. Like I said, my mom had her foible of being late. So, whenever we would arrive at the hospital, which was not nearby, it was about a 40-minute trip to the hospital. I grew up in Salisbury, Pennsylvania. The hospital that my dad would go to, there is a hospital close by, but he would go to the one in LaVale, Maryland. It's not there anymore. It was called Sacred Heart Hospital. So, my mom parked the car, and I would walk in ahead of her, because I knew until she looked through her purse and dealt with my younger brother, no matter how much assistance I would give her, it would always be 10 minutes later that we would walk in. And I walked in that day, and I saw my father. My father's head had swollen grotesquely. It turned out that his lungs were leaking air through his tissues. That sensation that you get whenever you feel the bubbles escaping through the soles of your shoes whenever you're walking through a creek. It's what my father's skin felt like. My mother thought it felt like the beans shifting in a beanbag. You could feel the little pockets of air underneath his skin. They hooked up this device to his side called a post-operative pump. And we would sit there and work the air bubbles towards that pump, trying to get that out of his system. Didn't work. The doctors decided that surgery was going to be the best way. Keep in mind, I was very young. I was 16, I believe. 1990. I believe I was 16 years old at the time. And I was in quite an amount of pain. I'd actually snapped off a tendon. I was in a cast. But the way I remember them telling me the surgery would go is that they would cut my dad from his sternum, kind of a half moon shape underneath of his arm, to his spine. And then they would go in, scrape the rib cage raw, and then close him back up. The scar tissue would adhere to the outside of the lungs, sealing off the leaks. My dad wasn't in good health. And I had a younger brother. I had a brother who was around 5 years old, 11 years my junior. Really, the surgery happened because of him. They didn't want to see this little 5-year-old go without a father. It's been many years, but I seem to remember the number 20% being banded around as the chance that my dad would make it through the surgery. But my dad, being the tough as nails World War II vet that he was, he made it through. And then a few days later, as he's lying in the intensive care unit, tubes going into every orifice of his body, that food tube that goes up your nose, the white paste in that turned pink. This was trouble. This was a lot of trouble. That food tube had turned pink because there was so much blood in my father's stomach that it was staining it, that it was going up the tube. He had developed pinhole ulcers that covered the inside of his stomach. Combination of stress and medicine, I imagine. They said for every square inch of my father's stomach, there was 14 to 16 ulcers bleeding. They went down through his throat twice to try to burn them shut, to cauterize them. And that failed. They went through his groin twice to try to find the artery to his stomach, to tie it off. And that failed. One of the doctors, who I will not name, for privacy's sake, I don't know if this doctor is still alive or not. One of the doctors had a child the same age as my younger brother. And that hit him. That hit him hard. He made the decision that he was going to remove my father's stomach. He would not survive the surgery. We were told that. Get ready to say goodbye. There is no way that your father will survive this surgery. But we're going to try. We're going to do everything we can to keep Paul Mort alive. The next day, what else can you do? I went to school. As cold as that sounds, I went to school. Because I knew if I kept busy, I would be okay. I don't know, maybe that's a fault of my own. There was nothing else to do. What was the point of sitting around whenever I could distract myself? I'd said goodbye to my father the night before, thinking that was it. He's going to die today. Then I got a call. My dad was okay. My dad was okay. Not only was my dad okay, the bleeding had stopped. He'd been taking off life support. He was breathing on his own. When I finally got the chance to talk to him, he told me that one of the doctors came in and his vitals were starting to fade. The doctor looked down and said, "Paul, you know what's happening, right?" And Paul knew what was happening. He was dying. So, with the breathing tube down his throat, my dad nodded. And the doctor, who my dad was good friends with, told him it'll be about 2 minutes. Essentially telling my father, you've got 2 minutes to live. Suddenly, my father said that he found himself inside of a field. And all around him were people. And people that he couldn't make the face out of. Except for one person. Now, I'm not here to push religion. I'm not here to say that your religion is wrong and mine is right. In fact, I'm a different religion now than I was then. At the time, I was Lutheran. But through my experiences, I've become a deist. I believe that God exists, but I believe he's a pretty hands-off creature. Or entity. Being. And I'm a bad deist at that. Because I don't believe God is completely hands-off. I see God as a chef. You don't stare at a cake the entire time it's in the oven. You walk away. I think God looks at the universe like that. He doesn't keep an eye on it constantly. He peeks in, makes changes, goes. But, be that what it is, my father said there was one person that he could make out the face of. And he knew that person was Jesus. But he said it wasn't Jesus like you saw in portraits or in movies. It looked like he was the same age as my father. My dad never said so, but I always took that to mean. I took that to be Jesus's way, or God's way, or whatever this being of love and compassion's way of saying, I have been with you every day of your life. And then my dad came back. And the bleeding stopped. For no reason. My dad never had his stomach taken out. For no reason, the bleeding stopped. For no reason, his lungs started to work on their own. My mother told me that whenever she went down to see him, and she walked through the doors of the ICU, and my dad's sitting up, joking with the doctors, that she almost passed out. We had about half a year with my father until he died. It was a really good half a year. We went from a miserable 3 years to a decent Christmas at home, and we went on a family vacation. We went on a vacation. Not a massive one. My dad drove. My dad, it's hard to explain to you how amazing it is that my dad drove a van several hours. And my mom was certain he was going to die on that trip. She was sure of it. Because he still wasn't in amazing health. But she was sure that he was going to die. But she said at least he would die happy. He would die doing something that he loved. We went to the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon. Yes, that is a thing. We stayed at a horrid motel that should not exist anymore. I hope it doesn't. The ABC Motel. We went to the Pennsylvania Grand Canyon. We walked. We made it back home. And a few weeks later, my dad did pass away. It was very quick. It was fairly peaceful. Looking back on it, I think that whatever you want to call it, you want to call it Allah, Jesus, Muhammad, God, the entity, the universe, it knew we weren't ready to give up my father yet, and gave us 6 more beautiful months. And even if my dad would have had the standard going through a tunnel of light, seeing your dead relatives come back, I probably would still be an atheist. I mean, it could have been DMT, right? Could have been the brain, one last gasp of consciousness, oxygen deprivation. But the fact that he went someplace, came back, and the bleeding stopped, and his lungs started working again, and he was healthier in that 6 months than he had been in 5 years. Well, I mean, that's like the next best thing to, like, here's a shining rock from the Silver City. Maybe it makes me a bad Christian. I don't have faith because I have proof. I can't go through my life saying there is no God. Science, most science is right. Penn Jillette is right. Dawkins is right. And who knows, they may be. But for me, I have to believe God exists because he did me a favor. He made something happen that nobody on this planet could. And I guess for that, I'll keep believing in him. Thank you for joining us this week on Strange Pathways. If you'd like to get in contact with me, you can do so at strangepathwaysmail@gmail.com. Go over to Facebook. We're going to have a few pictures from the tales today. And if you're on YouTube, be sure to hit like, comment on the video, subscribe. Get out there and tell your friends. That's the way we're going to make this show grow. You know that you have a friend that's going to love this show. Please point them in our direction. Huge thank you. I see a few people on a few forums in the X board talking about the show. Big thanks for that. As always, take care of yourselves and each other.